When he pointed his finger at me in front of the entire family and shouted those words that still echo in my head, I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. "You are not part of this family." The words came from the mouth of my own husband, the man I shared 23 years of my life with, the father of my children, the person who swore to love and respect me until death do us part. And as he humiliated me there, in the living room of the house I helped build, everyone laughed. My sister-in-law Jennifer let out a loud mocking laugh. My father-in-law Thomas gave that smirk that always made me uncomfortable, and even my daughter Madison looked away with a half-smile on her face. I stood frozen in the doorway of the living room, holding the lasagna dish I had so lovingly prepared for Thanksgiving dinner, as tears began to burn my eyes. It was at that moment that I realized something was very wrong, that this humiliation was not just another one of my husband Robert's tantrums, but rather the result of something much bigger and much more sinister that had been plotted behind my back for months. Let me rewind a bit so you can understand how I got to that devastating moment. My name is Sarah, I'm 47 years old, and I've always considered myself a lucky woman. I married Robert when I was just 24, right after graduating from nursing school. He was charming, ambitious, worked as a manager at a tech company, and seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. For the first few years, everything was perfect. We had 2 beautiful children, Madison and Tyler. We bought our first home in a quiet neighborhood outside Seattle, and I managed to balance my nursing career with the responsibilities of being a mother and wife. Robert was always very close to his family, especially his sister Jennifer, who was only 2 years younger than him. I tried to maintain a cordial relationship with everyone, attended Sunday brunches at my in-laws' house, organized birthday parties, and did my best to be the perfect daughter-in-law and sister-in-law. But I always sensed there was something off about the family dynamic, an underlying tension I couldn't quite identify. Things began to change about 2 years ago, when Robert's father, Thomas, suffered a stroke that left him partially disabled. His mother, Margaret, had died 5 years earlier from cancer, and the responsibility of caring for Thomas naturally fell to the children. Jennifer was single, childless, and worked as a lawyer at a large firm in downtown Seattle. Robert suggested that his father move in with us, and I agreed without hesitation. After all, we were family, and I knew how important it was for Robert to be close to his father during this difficult time. We converted the downstairs office into a bedroom for Thomas, hired a nurse to help during the day, and I took on much of the nighttime and weekend care. As a nurse, I had the experience and knew exactly what to do. Thomas required physical therapy, regular medical monitoring, and a lot of patience to deal with the limitations the stroke had caused. For the first few months, everything seemed to be going well. Thomas was grateful for the help, Robert seemed relieved to have his father nearby, and even Jennifer came to visit more often. But it was precisely during these visits that I began to notice subtle changes in everyone's behavior. Jennifer would always arrive with some comment about how disorganized the house was, or how I could be taking better care of Thomas. She questioned the medications I was administering, even though I was a nurse and strictly followed medical orders. She suggested changes to his diet, criticized the way I organized his physical therapy, and always found something to complain about. At first, I tried to ignore it. After all, she was worried about her father. It was natural that she wanted the best for him. But over time, I realized that the criticism wasn't constructive, it was destructive. Jennifer wasn't trying to help, she was trying to discredit me, to make me look incompetent in front of Robert and Thomas. And it worked. Robert began to question my decisions regarding his father's care. He, who had never been deeply involved in medical matters, suddenly became an expert, always repeating things Jennifer had said. "Are you sure this medication is right? Jennifer said there are better alternatives. Shouldn't we hire another nurse? Jennifer knows an excellent professional. Why don't you prepare the meals Jennifer suggested? She's done extensive research on the ideal diet for stroke patients." Each comment was like a small needle, but I swallowed my frustration and continued to do my best. I worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital, came home exhausted, and still dedicated my free time to caring for Thomas, preparing healthy meals for the whole family, and keeping the house clean and organized. But nothing I did seemed to be enough. Things got worse when Jennifer started spending more time at our house. She'd show up unannounced, spend hours quietly chatting with Robert in the office, and always leave with that satisfied smile on her face. I began to feel like an intruder in my own home. Thomas, who was initially kind and grateful, began to change with me as well. He became impatient when I took too long to answer his calls, complained about the food I prepared, and always asked for Jennifer to be called when there was a decision to be made about his treatment. It was as if I'd become invisible, irrelevant, even though I was the one who was there every day, every night, caring for him with dedication and affection. My children also began to distance themselves from me. Madison, who had always been closer to her father, began repeating comments that clearly came from him or Jennifer. "Mom, why don't you do things the way Aunt Jennifer suggests? Maybe she's right about Grandpa needing more professional care." Tyler, my youngest son, simply locked himself in his room and avoided deeper conversations with me. I felt like I was slowly losing my family, but I couldn't quite understand what was happening. I tried to talk to Robert several times, expressing my feelings, telling him I felt disrespected and undervalued, but he always avoided the conversation or accused me of being dramatic and jealous of Jennifer. 3 months before that fateful Thanksgiving, things took an even stranger turn. Robert began having frequent meetings with Jennifer and Thomas, always behind closed doors. When I asked what they discussed, Robert was evasive, saying it was just family matters and financial planning for Thomas's future. I was completely excluded from these conversations, as if my opinion didn't matter, as if I wasn't part of the family. I began to suspect something was afoot, but I didn't imagine the extent of the betrayal that lay ahead. I tried to approach Thomas, asking if everything was okay, if there was anything I could do to improve his care, but he only mumbled vague answers and asked me to call Jennifer. It was during this period that I began to notice changes in Robert's financial behavior. He had always been careful with money, but suddenly he was making expensive purchases without consulting me, paying bills I didn't even know existed, and being extremely secretive about our financial situation. When I questioned him, he exploded, saying I had no right to control his money, that he worked hard and could spend as he pleased. This alarmed me because we had always had a joint account and always decided on important expenses together, and suddenly I was being treated like an outsider regarding our own family's finances. I tried to access our online bank account and discovered that Robert had changed all the passwords. I went to the bank in person and was informed that I would need his authorization for any transactions or detailed inquiries. At that moment, a feeling of panic began to grip me. Something was very wrong, and I was being systematically excluded from every aspect of my family life. I tried talking to a close friend, Linda, who is a family law attorney. She advised me to be vigilant, document everything I could, and seriously consider the possibility that Robert was plotting against me. But I didn't want to believe it. Despite all the signs, despite the coldness with which I was being treated, I still loved my husband and couldn't imagine he would betray me so cruelly. I continued trying to be the perfect wife, the devoted caregiver, the present mother, hoping that things would get better, that this was just a difficult phase we were going through. Thanksgiving arrived, and I was determined to make everything perfect. I spent days planning the menu, buying quality ingredients, and preparing special dishes I knew everyone would love. I woke up at 5 in the morning to start cooking. I prepared the turkey with a special recipe I'd learned from my mother, made homemade mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce from scratch, 3 different kinds of pie, and that vegetable lasagna Thomas always loved. The house was immaculate, decorated with fresh flowers and scented candles, and the table was set with the fine china we'd saved for special occasions. Everything was perfect, or at least I thought it was. Jennifer arrived first, carrying only an expensive bottle of wine and that smile I'd learned to dread. She strolled through the kitchen, eyed everything I'd prepared with a barely concealed expression of disapproval, and commented on how she would have done things differently. Robert greeted her with a warm hug he hadn't given me in months, and the two of them locked themselves in the living room with Thomas for another of their secret meetings. I tried to join them, but Robert dismissed me, telling me I should continue preparing dinner. I went to the kitchen with a heavy heart, feeling like I was serving strangers instead of my own family. Madison arrived shortly after with her boyfriend, and Tyler only came down from his room when called several times. No one helped me with the final preparations, no one asked if I needed anything, Everyone was busy chatting animatedly in the living room while I worked alone. When I finally called everyone to the table, the reception was cold. Jennifer insisted on examining each dish, commenting loudly on how she would have seasoned it differently, how the presentation could have been better, how she'd seen more interesting recipes on cooking websites. Robert agreed with everything she said, adding his own disparaging comments. Thomas simply pushed his food around his plate with a look of disgust. Madison and her boyfriend chatted among themselves, completely ignoring me. Tyler ate in silence, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. I tried to strike up a pleasant conversation, talking about the good things that had happened during the year, but I was repeatedly interrupted or simply ignored. It was after dinner that everything exploded. I had gotten up to get the pies from the kitchen when I heard Jennifer say something about not understanding why I was still there. I returned to the dining room with the platter in my hands, and the atmosphere was visibly tense. Robert looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of anger and contempt that chilled me to the bone. Jennifer had that satisfied smile, Thomas looked at me coldly, and my children seemed to know exactly what was about to happen. That's when I told him I'd made 3 kinds of pie and asked which one everyone wanted to try first. Robert abruptly rose from his chair, slamming his hands down on the table, making all the plates and silverware rattle. He started yelling. "Don't you really realize, Sarah? Don't you understand that no one here wants your food, your attention, your presence?" I froze, unable to process what was happening. He continued, each word more venomous than the last. "You are a failure as a wife, as a mother, as a caregiver. Jennifer showed me how incompetent you are. My father nearly died several times because of your neglect. Our children grew up without a real mother because you were always too busy with your meaningless work." Each accusation was absurd, unfounded, completely distorted from reality, but he wouldn't stop. And that's when he pointed his finger at me, hatred in his eyes, and shouted those devastating words. "You don't belong in this family." The room erupted in laughter. Jennifer was the first, that loud, cruel laugh that seemed to echo in every corner of the house. Thomas gave that crooked smile that made me feel sick. Madison looked away but couldn't hide a half-smile. Even her boyfriend, who barely knew me, chuckled uncomfortably. Tyler just lowered his head, clearly embarrassed but lacking the courage to defend me. I stood there, frozen in the entrance to the dining room, still holding that dish of lasagna I had prepared with such care, while the people I loved ridiculed me in the cruelest ways possible. Tears began streaming down my face without me being able to control them, and I felt my legs tremble, as if they would give way at any moment. It was at that moment that the doorbell rang. A simple, ordinary sound, but it cut through the tension in the room like a knife. Robert rolled his eyes, still with that disdainful expression on his face, muttered something about who might be bothering him at that moment, and went to answer the door with heavy steps. Jennifer took the opportunity to make another snide comment, something about how I always found a way to interrupt important family moments. Thomas let out an irritated sigh. I remained there, motionless, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how my life had fallen apart so completely. I heard Robert open the front door, and his voice changed instantly. The aggressive, superior tone disappeared, replaced by something that sounded like confusion mixed with fear. "What are you doing here?" he asked, and there was a tremor in his voice I hadn't expected. I couldn't see who was at the front door from where I was, but I noticed Jennifer rising from her chair, curious. She walked to the living room to get a better view, and I saw her face pale completely. Thomas tried to get up from his wheelchair, clearly agitated, asking what was going on. Madison and her boyfriend looked at each other, lost. Tyler finally looked up, interested. Then I heard a calm but firm female voice coming from the front door. "Good evening, Robert. I've come to get what's mine." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the whole house seem utterly silent. I set the dish down on the nearest table and walked slowly toward the living room, needing to see who this person was who had caused such a reaction in Robert and Jennifer. What I saw left me completely confused. A woman in her 60s stood in the doorway, well-dressed, with perfectly groomed gray hair and a posture that radiated determination and authority. Beside her was a younger man, perhaps in his early 40s, holding a briefcase and wearing a formal suit. Behind them, on the sidewalk, a black car was parked. The woman entered without waiting for an invitation, her eyes darting around the room until they landed on Thomas, who was still trying to get up from his wheelchair. "Margaret," was all Thomas could say, and his voice was thick with something that sounded like shock and terror. Margaret. But that was the name of Robert's mother, the woman who had supposedly died of cancer 5 years ago. I looked at Robert, who was white as a sheet, completely paralyzed. Jennifer had her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with panic. The man in the suit next to Margaret introduced himself as David Walsh, attorney at law, and said we all needed to sit down because there was important information that needed to be shared immediately. My brain struggled to process what was happening. Was Margaret alive? How was that possible? Robert had taken me to her funeral. I had watched a casket being buried. I had comforted my husband for months as he grieved the loss of his mother. But there she was, alive, standing in our living room, looking at Thomas with a mixture of anger and heartbreak that was palpable. She turned to me, and for the first time since she'd walked in, her eyes softened. "You must be Sarah," she said, her voice holding a gentle tone that contrasted completely with the tension of the situation. "I'm sorry you've been dragged into this mess. You're as much a victim as I was." Attorney David began to explain, his professional voice echoing through the room as everyone was still in shock. Margaret hadn't died 5 years ago. She had been fraudulently declared dead by Thomas, with the help of Robert and Jennifer, as part of an elaborate scheme to steal her inheritance and property. Margaret had been ill, yes, but not from terminal cancer as everyone had been led to believe. She had been diagnosed with a treatable condition that required hospitalization and care, but while vulnerable in the hospital, Thomas had forged documents, bribed people, and with the help of his children, created a false death certificate for her. When Margaret recovered and was discharged, she discovered she was officially dead, that all her bank accounts had been emptied, that her assets had been transferred to Thomas, and that her family had simply continued their lives as if she had never existed. David explained that Margaret had spent the last 5 years fighting to prove she was alive, reverse the fraud, and gather evidence against Thomas, Robert, and Jennifer. She had worked with lawyers, private investigators, and even federal authorities because the scheme involved bank fraud, falsification of government documents, and money laundering. The investigation had revealed that Margaret's inheritance, which included several valuable properties, substantial investments, and a bank account with over $2 million, had been divided between Thomas and his children. Robert had used part of this money to buy the house where we were living, to make investments in his name, and to maintain a lifestyle he could never have afforded on his salary alone. Jennifer had used her share to open her own law firm and to purchase a luxury apartment downtown. I stared at Robert with growing horror, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal and criminality he'd been involved in. Had he actively participated in declaring his own mother dead just for money? And all these years, had he lied to me, to our children, to everyone around us? Was the funeral we attended fake? Was the coffin empty? Were the tears he shed all an act? Margaret continued, her voice trembling with emotion but remaining steadfast. She described how devastating it was to wake up and discover that her own family had tried to erase her from existence, how she'd had to rebuild her identity from scratch, how she'd lived in shelters and friends' homes while struggling to prove she was alive, how humiliating it had been to have to convince government institutions that she wasn't dead. David then moved on to the part that directly concerned me, and here my story connected with Margaret's in a way I never could have imagined. He explained that during the investigation, they discovered that Robert was planning to do something similar to me. The secret meetings with Jennifer and Thomas weren't just about caring for Thomas. They were about how to financially exclude me from the family, how to transfer all assets in our joint name to Robert's name alone, and eventually, how to get rid of me completely. Jennifer, with her experience as a lawyer, was helping orchestrate the plan, creating documents that would make me appear financially irresponsible, mentally unstable, or negligent in caring for Thomas. The plan, as David revealed through emails and messages legally obtained during the investigation, was to make me appear incompetent as Thomas's caretaker, eventually accuse me of some form of abuse or neglect, use this as grounds for a divorce where I would walk away empty-handed, and then take all the assets we had built together during 23 years of marriage. The house was being quietly transferred into Robert's name alone. Joint bank accounts were being emptied, and the money moved to accounts I had no access to. Even my retirement plan was being targeted, with Robert trying to find legal ways to claim part of it in the inevitable divorce. I felt my legs finally give way, and I fell heavily onto the nearest sofa. Everything made sense now. The constant criticism, the discrediting of my work as a caregiver, the exclusion from family conversations, Robert's distant behavior, the change in my bank passwords. It was all part of a calculated plan to destroy me financially and emotionally. I wasn't going crazy, I wasn't being dramatic. I was being systematically set up to be discarded and left with nothing. I looked at my children, Madison and Tyler, and saw confusion and horror on their faces. They clearly didn't know the extent of what was happening. They had been manipulated by Robert and Jennifer into believing I was the problem, but they weren't actively involved in the criminal scheme. Margaret approached me and sat beside me, gently taking my hand. "I know exactly how you're feeling right now," she said softly. "The feeling of betrayal, of having your reality completely turned upside down, of discovering that the people you loved were capable of cruelties you never imagined possible. But you need to know that you're not alone, and that unlike me, you were spared years of suffering because we managed to stop it before their plan was fully executed." She explained that she had investigated me too, not because she suspected me, but because she needed to understand the entire family structure and identify who the victims and perpetrators were. When she realized what was being planned against me, she decided to expedite her legal action and intervene before it was too late. David then presented a series of documents. There were arrest warrants for Thomas, Robert, and Jennifer for fraud, forgery, money laundering, and conspiracy. There were court orders freezing all assets obtained through Margaret's stolen money, including our home. There were documents reversing all property transfers Robert had attempted to make in my name without my knowledge or actual consent. And there was a document offering me the opportunity to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for full immunity, as it became clear from the evidence gathered that I had no knowledge of the crimes being committed and was, in fact, another victim of the scheme. It was then that police officers entered through the still open door and began reading Thomas, Robert, and Jennifer their rights. The scene that followed was chaotic. Jennifer tried to argue, using her legal knowledge to question the proceedings, but was quickly silenced by the officers. Thomas began to cry, claiming he was too ill and frail to be arrested, but the officers had already prepared appropriate medical accommodations. Robert glared at me with one last expression of anger, as if somehow this was all my fault, as if I had betrayed him instead of the other way around. He was handcuffed and escorted out without a word. The house, which had been filled with cruel laughter directed at me just minutes before, was now completely silent, except for the sounds of police car doors closing outside. Madison began to cry, finally understanding the gravity of what her father had done. Tyler came to me and hugged me for the first time in months, mumbling repeated apologies. I was in complete shock, unable to process how quickly everything had changed. Just 30 minutes ago, I was being humiliated and ostracized from my own family. Now, I discovered I was the victim of a complex criminal scheme, that my mother-in-law, whom I thought was dead, was alive and had saved me from destruction, and that my husband and his family were going to be arrested for serious crimes. It was too surreal to feel real. Margaret stayed with me for hours that night, after all the officers had left and David Walsh left stacks of documents for me to review. She told me her full story, the horrific details of how she woke up in the hospital recovered from her illness only to discover she legally no longer existed, how she had to sleep in her car for weeks because she couldn't access her money or property, how some people she considered friends didn't believe she was actually alive and thought she was delusional or trying to pull a scam. She told me about the utter loneliness of being erased from her own life, of watching her family carry on as if she had never existed, of not being able to simply come forward and reveal she was alive because she needed time to build a solid legal case that would secure justice. She also helped me understand the signs I'd missed over the years, the small clues that Robert was never truly the person I thought he was. She mentioned that even when Robert was a child, there were signs of extreme selfishness and a lack of empathy, which she tried to correct through education and discipline, but that Thomas always undermined her efforts, teaching his children that getting what they wanted at any cost was more important than integrity or compassion. She revealed that Robert and Jennifer had learned from Thomas early on to manipulate situations and people for their own benefit, and that she herself had been a victim of emotional manipulation throughout her marriage with Thomas. In the following days, my life became a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, interviews with investigators, sessions with therapists, and attempts to explain to friends and acquaintances what had happened. The news spread quickly. The story of a woman fraudulently declared dead by her own family was too sensational not to go viral. Journalists began contacting me, neighbors who had barely spoken to me suddenly wanted to know every detail, and my co-workers at the hospital looked at me with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. It was devastating and liberating at the same time. Devastating because my private life was exposed for all to see, because I had to face the reality that my marriage was a lie, because I had to rebuild my identity outside of the role of Robert's wife. But liberating because I finally understood that none of what had happened was my fault, that the criticism and humiliation were not based on my actual failings but rather a calculated plan to destabilize me. The legal process unfolded over the following months. Robert attempted to strike a deal, offering to testify against Thomas and Jennifer in exchange for a reduced sentence. But Margaret refused any deal that didn't include significant prison time for all three. Jennifer, ironically, used all her legal knowledge to try to find loopholes and technicalities that might save her, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Thomas, whose health had truly deteriorated under the stress of the arrest and trial, tried to evoke sympathy by claiming he didn't have long to live and should be allowed to spend his final days free. But the judge showed no mercy for someone who had tried to erase his own wife from existence out of greed. During this time, Margaret and I developed a close relationship we never had when she was officially alive and I was married to Robert. She was the mother-in-law I always longed for, compassionate, wise, strong, and genuinely interested in my well-being. She helped me navigate the divorce process, which was quickly approved given the criminal circumstances involved. She connected me with excellent lawyers who ensured I kept everything that was rightfully mine and that I wouldn't be penalized for Robert's crimes. The house, which had been purchased primarily with money stolen from Margaret, was sold, and the proceeds were returned to her as part of the court-ordered restitution. But Margaret, in a gesture of generosity that brought me to tears, used some of that money to help me buy a smaller but comfortable apartment in a neighborhood I had always loved, telling me I deserved a fresh start in a place that was truly mine. My children dealt with the situation differently. Madison was initially furious, trying to find ways to justify her father's actions, arguing that perhaps there were explanations we weren't understanding. It took months of family therapy and difficult conversations for her to begin to accept the reality of what Robert had done. She eventually apologized for participating in my humiliation that Thanksgiving, explaining that Robert had spent months convincing her that I was neglecting their grandfather, that I was becoming unstable, that it was better for everyone if she treated me with distance. Tyler, on the other hand, quickly aligned himself with Margaret and me. He admitted that he had always felt something was wrong, that his father's behavior seemed fake and manipulative, but that he hadn't had the courage to question it until the full truth came out. The trial was one of the most difficult moments of my life. I had to sit in that courtroom and listen in detail to the entire plan that had been hatched to destroy me. I listened to recordings of conversations between Robert and Jennifer where they discussed ways to make me appear incompetent. I read emails where they planned to create situations that would make me appear negligent in Thomas's care. I saw documents that had been forged with my supposed signature, authorizing asset transfers I never knew were happening. Each revelation was like a new stab in the back, but it was also liberating because it confirmed that my intuition was correct, that I wasn't crazy, that there really was something sinister going on behind my back. When it was my turn to testify, I told everything. I described the years of emotional manipulation, the constant criticism disguised as concern, the systematic exclusion from family decisions, the humiliation of that Thanksgiving, orchestrated specifically to break me emotionally and create witnesses that I was being rejected by my family. I explained how I worked tirelessly to care for Thomas while being constantly disqualified, how I dedicated my life to being a good wife and mother while secretly being considered disposable and inconvenient. I looked directly at Robert as I spoke, and for the first time in years, I felt no fear or insecurity. I felt righteous anger, appropriate indignation, and a power that came from finally knowing and speaking my truth without being silenced or invalidated. Margaret also testified, and her story was even more impactful than mine. She described in graphic detail what it was like to wake up in the hospital feeling better, ready to go home, only to discover that her husband had told the doctors and everyone else that she had passed away during the night. How she was escorted out of the hospital in complete confusion when she tried to prove her identity and was told there was an official death certificate with her name on it. How she tried to access her bank accounts and discovered they were closed because the account holder was dead. How she went to the police and was initially dismissed because the official documents all said Margaret Walsh was dead and buried. How she had to hire private investigators with money she borrowed from a distant cousin who was the only person who believed her. She recounted the day she secretly attended her own funeral, watching from afar as Thomas, Robert, and Jennifer cried fake tears and accepted condolences from friends and family. How devastating it was to see loved ones deceived, to see her empty casket buried, to hear Robert deliver an emotional speech about how much he missed his mother when she knew he was counting her stolen money and planning how to spend it. How she wanted to scream, to reveal herself, to end the charade right then and there, but was restrained by her lawyers who insisted she needed to build a solid case first or risk no justice at all. Margaret also revealed that part of the reason she focused so much on saving me when she discovered what was being planned against me was because she saw herself in me. She recognized the patterns of manipulation, the way Robert was using the same tactics Thomas had used against her for years. She couldn't allow another woman to go through what she had, not when she had the power and knowledge to intervene. She said I became the daughter she wished she had had, someone with integrity, compassion, and real strength rather than the cruelty disguised as ambition that characterized Robert and Jennifer. The final verdict came after weeks of trial. Thomas was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison, although we all knew he likely wouldn't live long enough to serve the full sentence given his failing health. Robert was sentenced to 12 years. With the possibility of parole after 8 if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. Jennifer, whose performance as a knowledgeable attorney made her crimes even more serious in the eyes of the court, received 14 years and had her license to practice law permanently revoked. When the sentences were read, I felt no joy or satisfaction, only a profound weariness and a sense of closure. That chapter of my life was finally, definitively closed. The following months were spent rebuilding and rediscovering myself. I moved into my new apartment, a 2-bedroom space in a charming building near a park I'd frequented before I got married. I decorated each room according to my own taste, without having to consider Robert's opinion on colors, furniture, or arrangements. For the first time in decades, I was creating a space that was completely and authentically my own. I bought plants, hung paintings I loved, and chose colorful crockery instead of the neutral, formal pieces Robert always insisted on. Every small decision felt like an affirmation of my regained autonomy. At work, I received amazing support from my colleagues and supervisors. My boss, a veteran nurse named Patricia, called me into her office a few days after the trial and told me something I'll never forget. "Sarah, I've always seen a special light in you, a genuine dedication to patients that's rare in this profession. Over the past few years, I've seen that light gradually dim, and now I understand why. You were being systematically destroyed at home, yet you still came to work and gave your all for our patients. That's true strength, and I want you to know that this hospital values you immensely." She then offered me a promotion to a supervisory position I'd been passed over years earlier, admitting that Robert had called the hospital at the time claiming I was going through personal issues and wasn't up to taking on more responsibilities, something I never knew had happened. I accepted the promotion and threw myself into my work with renewed energy and purpose. I discovered that without the constant emotional drain of living with Robert, without the nagging anxiety of never being good enough, without the exhaustion of caring for Thomas while being criticized for everything I did, I had much more mental and emotional capacity to devote to my career. I began attending nursing conferences, taking specialization courses, and mentoring younger nurses. I rediscovered the passion for medicine that had led me to this profession in the first place, a passion that had been stifled under years of manipulation and devaluation. My relationship with my children also began to heal, though it was a slow and sometimes painful process. Madison eventually moved into my apartment for a few months while she processed her own feelings about her father and worked through therapy to deal with the guilt of having participated in my humiliation. We had many difficult conversations, long nights of crying and apologizing repeatedly, and I had to constantly reassure her that I loved her and didn't blame her for Robert's actions. It was during this time that I truly got to know my daughter for the first time, not as an extension of Robert, but as a complex individual struggling with her own issues and trauma. Tyler kept in regular contact with me from the beginning, visiting weekly, calling whenever he needed advice or just wanted to talk. He had started college to study psychology, inspired by his family's experiences and a desire to better understand the dynamics of manipulation and abuse. He told me he wanted to work helping others going through similar situations, that he wanted to transform family trauma into something positive and constructive. I was immensely proud of him and the man he was becoming, one with empathy, integrity, and the courage to face difficult truths. Margaret became a constant and beloved presence in my life. We had dinner together at least once a week, shared stories, laughed at silly things, and planned little trips. She introduced me to her friends, incredible women of various ages and backgrounds who had gone through their own struggles and emerged stronger. For the first time, I had a social circle that was my own, not connected to Robert or defined by my role as his wife. These women saw me for who I was, appreciated my qualities, and created a space where I could be authentic without fear of judgment or manipulation. It was Margaret who encouraged me to enter therapy, not only to process the trauma of what had happened, but to truly understand the patterns that led me to remain in such a toxic relationship for so long. My therapist, a compassionate woman named Dr. Linda Chen, helped me recognize that I had grown up in a family where my worth was measured by my usefulness, by my ability to care for others and put their needs before my own. This made me vulnerable to people like Robert, who intuitively recognized and exploited this trait. I learned about healthy boundaries, the difference between genuine love and emotional manipulation, and how to recognize warning signs in relationships. One of the most transformative moments in my healing journey came about a year after that fateful Thanksgiving. I was in the park near my apartment, sitting on a bench reading a book, when a woman hesitantly approached. She apologized for interrupting but explained that she recognized my face from news reports about the case. I expected her to be just another curious person wanting morbid details, but instead, she sat down next to me and began to cry. She explained that she was in a marriage where she felt she was losing her sanity, where her husband constantly criticized and belittled her, where she felt increasingly isolated from friends and family, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong because he never yelled or hit her. When she saw my story in the news, something clicked. She recognized the patterns, saw her own relationship reflected in the manipulative tactics Robert had used against me. My story gave her the courage to seek help, to speak to a lawyer, to begin documenting her husband's behavior. She thanked me because, in her words, I had saved her life by going public with my experience. That conversation impacted me deeply. I realized that my suffering, as painful as it had been, could have purpose if it helped others recognize similar situations in their own lives before it was too late. Inspired by that encounter, I began working with local organizations that supported victims of emotional and financial abuse. I spoke at community groups, sharing my story and educating people about the subtle signs of manipulation and coercive control. I discovered that I had a voice, that my experience had value, that I could help others as I continued my own healing journey. Each person who approached me after a talk saying that my story had resonated with them, that they had recognized patterns in their own life, that they felt less alone and more empowered to take action, gave me a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. Margaret often joined me at these talks, and together we became powerful advocates for legal reform related to family fraud and financial abuse. We worked with legislators to strengthen laws that protected vulnerable people from being declared fraudulently dead, to create stronger safeguards for property transfers between spouses, to ensure victims of financial manipulation had better legal recourse. It was hard work, often frustrating, but incredibly meaningful. We were turning our pain into real change, creating protections so that others wouldn't have to go through what we had. About 18 months after that Thanksgiving that changed everything, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Robert, sent from prison. My first instinct was to throw it away without reading it, but after talking with my therapist and Margaret, I decided to open it. The letter was short and, surprisingly, seemed genuine. Robert didn't try to justify himself or minimize what he had done. He acknowledged that he had destroyed our family, that he had betrayed my trust in unforgivable ways, that he had caused incalculable harm not only to me but also to our children. He said he was in therapy in prison, working to understand the behavioral patterns he had learned from Thomas, to process his own guilt and shame. Robert didn't apologize, saying he knew he didn't deserve it and didn't expect it. He simply wanted me to know that he finally understood the gravity of what he had done, that he would carry that guilt for the rest of his life, and that his greatest regret was wasting 23 years with an extraordinary woman because he was too obsessed with money and control to value what truly mattered. He ended the letter by saying he hoped I would find happiness and peace, that I deserved all the good things life had to offer, and that if there was any way he could contribute positively to my life or the lives of our children going forward, he would do so without expecting anything in return. I cried reading that letter, not from sadness or longing, but from a complex mix of emotions that included relief, residual anger, reluctant compassion, and most importantly, a sense of closure. I didn't respond to the letter immediately. It took me weeks to process my feelings, talking with my therapist about what, if anything, I wanted to say to Robert. Eventually, I wrote a brief response acknowledging that I had received his letter, that I appreciated his acknowledgement of the harm done, but that I wasn't in a place where I could or wanted to have any kind of relationship with him, not even through correspondence. I wished him genuine growth and healing, but made it clear that my healing required permanent distance from him. I shared Robert's letter with Madison and Tyler, letting them decide whether they wanted to have any contact with their father. Madison chose to keep her distance, still too hurt and betrayed to consider any kind of reconciliation. Tyler eventually began visiting Robert in prison occasionally, not to exonerate him, but because he felt he needed to better understand who his father really was and why he made the choices he did. I respected both their decisions, making it clear that I would support them regardless of how they chose to handle their relationship with Robert. Margaret had an interesting reaction to the letter. She said it seemed genuine, that perhaps Robert was indeed doing the difficult work of facing his flaws and growing as a person, but that this didn't change what he had done or eliminate the just consequences he was facing. She also pointed out, with characteristic wisdom, that true change would be demonstrated through consistent actions over time, not through pretty words in a letter. If Robert had truly changed, it would become evident in the years to come through how he treated others, how he took responsibility for his actions, and how he contributed positively to the world even from within prison. As for Jennifer and Thomas, I didn't hear anything from them directly. I learned through Madison, who kept an occasional contact with some cousins on Robert's side, that Jennifer was having an extremely difficult time in prison, unable to accept a new reality, still trying to manipulate and control even in an environment where that didn't work. Thomas had been transferred to a prison medical facility where he was receiving care for his deteriorating health. Part of me felt a pang of pity, especially for Thomas, who was elderly and ill, but Margaret quickly reminded me that they had made conscious choices that led to just consequences, and that feeling pity didn't mean they shouldn't face those consequences. As the years passed, my life continued to blossom in ways I never could have imagined on that devastating Thanksgiving Day. I met a kind man named Michael at a nursing conference, and we developed a friendship that slowly, carefully, evolved into something more. Michael was a widower, having lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, and understood what it was like to rebuild a life after profound loss. He never pressured me, respected my pace, and gradually showed me how a healthy relationship should be based on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine support rather than control and manipulation. Our relationship progressed slowly, and it was Margaret who encouraged me when I began to doubt my readiness. She reminded me that I had done years of therapeutic work, that I had rebuilt my self-esteem and established healthy boundaries, that I deserved love and companionship if that was what I wanted. Michael got to know my children, developed his own relationship with each of them, and never tried to replace Robert's role as their father but rather carved out his own space in our lives. He and Margaret became close friends, bonded by their shared respect for me and their recognition of all I had overcome. 3 years after that life-changing Thanksgiving, Michael proposed to me over a simple dinner in my apartment. It wasn't an elaborate or dramatic proposal. It was perfectly appropriate for who we were and where we were in our lives. He simply took my hand across the table and told me that the last 2 years with me had been the happiest since he lost his wife, that I inspired him with my strength and resilience, that he admired the woman I was, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me if I was willing to give him that privilege. I said yes, not because I needed someone to complete or validate me, but because I genuinely loved this man and wanted to build a future with him. Our wedding was small and intimate, held in the garden of the house Margaret had purchased after reclaiming her estate. Madison was my maid of honor, Tyler walked me down the aisle, and Margaret gave an emotional blessing that brought tears to everyone's eyes. We invited only the people who truly mattered, true friends and chosen family, rather than trying to impress a long list of acquaintances. It was the complete opposite of my first wedding, which had been an elaborate production focused on appearances over substance. This wedding was about genuine love, about conscious commitment, about two people who had lived full lives and faced profound loss choosing to create something new together. Today, 5 years after that Thanksgiving that could have destroyed me but instead freed me, I look back on my life with profound gratitude and a sense of peace I never thought possible. I have a healthy and happy marriage with Michael, where we are equal partners who support each other. I have healed and strong relationships with my children, who have become incredible adults despite the trauma they faced. I have Margaret, who is more of a mother to me than my own biological mother ever was. I have a fulfilling career, where I make a real difference in the lives of the patients I care for. I find purpose through my advocacy work, helping other victims of emotional and financial abuse find their own voices and paths to healing. Sometimes I still think about that night, the moment Robert pointed his finger at me and declared I wasn't part of the family while everyone laughed. I think about how small I felt, how humiliated, how utterly worthless. And then I think about how everything changed when that doorbell rang, how the truth Robert was desperate to hide exploded into our living room, how I discovered I was stronger than I ever imagined. That moment, as painful as it was the catalyst for everything good that came after. If Margaret hadn't shown up when she did, if she hadn't stepped in to save me while saving herself, I might have been destroyed financially and emotionally the way she nearly was. I learned so many lessons through this experience. I learned that true love doesn't involve control, constant criticism, or making someone feel inferior. I learned that my worth isn't determined by the approval of others, especially people who are trying to manipulate me for their own ends. I learned that trusting my instincts is crucial, that when something feels wrong, it probably is wrong, and that doubting my own perception was exactly what Robert and Jennifer wanted me to do. I learned that it's possible to completely rebuild your life even after being betrayed in the most profound ways by people you loved and trusted. I've learned that family isn't just about blood or legal ties. It's about people who genuinely care about you, who support you without expecting anything in return, who celebrate your successes instead of trying to diminish them. Margaret isn't my mother-in-law in the legal sense anymore, since I divorced her son, but she's family in all the ways that truly matter. She's there for me through thick and thin, challenges me when I need growth, comforts me when I'm struggling, and loves me unconditionally in a way I've never experienced before. I've learned that trauma can be transformed into purpose, that pain can be used to create positive change, that our most difficult story can become our greatest strength if we're willing to be vulnerable and share it with others. Every time I speak to a group and see faces light up with recognition, every time someone comes up afterward and says my story helped them see their own situation more clearly, every time I hear about someone who took action to protect themselves after hearing about my experience, I know my suffering was not in vain. It created something bigger than me, a wave of awareness and empowerment that continues to spread. And most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to start over, to reclaim your life, to become the person you truly are instead of the person others have tried to make you out to be. At 52, I'm living my most authentic and happy life. I'm not just surviving, I'm thriving. I'm no longer defining myself by someone else's standards. I'm creating my own based on my values, my passions, my dreams. I'm no longer accepting crumbs of affection and respect. I'm demanding and receiving genuine love and equal partnership. To anyone reading or listening to my story and recognizing elements of their own situation, I want to say this with all my heart. You're not crazy, you're not being dramatic, you're not overreacting. If you feel like something is wrong in your relationship, if you feel constantly criticized and undervalued, if you're being excluded from important decisions, If you feel like you're losing your identity, if you're being systematically isolated from people who support you, trust those feelings. Seek help. Talk to a therapist, a lawyer, trusted friends. Document everything. Protect your finances. Make an exit plan if necessary. And know that there is life on the other side, a better life than you can imagine right now, a life where you are valued, respected, and truly loved. For those who may be experiencing even more serious situations than I did, situations involving threats or physical violence, please seek help immediately. Contact domestic violence hotlines, local shelters, and the police. Your safety is our top priority. No one deserves to live in fear, no one deserves to be physically or emotionally abused, and there are resources available to help you get out safely. And for those who simply listen to my story for entertainment or out of curiosity, thank you for allowing me to share. If you know someone who might be in a similar situation, be the person who steps in, who asks if everything is okay, who offers support without judgment. You can literally save someone's life just by being present and willing to see what others are overlooking. Be the Margaret in someone's life, the person who shows up when they need it most and offers not just emotional support but concrete action. Looking back now, I realize that terrible Thanksgiving was actually the greatest gift I've ever received, though it certainly didn't feel that way at the time. It was the day Robert's mask finally slipped completely, the day I could no longer deceive myself about who he really was, the day I was forced to confront realities I'd been avoiding. But most importantly, it was the day Margaret walked through the door, literally coming from the dead to save not only herself, but me as well. It was the day my real life began, the day I began my journey back to myself. I won't lie and say it was easy. The first few months were incredibly difficult, filled with doubts, fears, tears, and moments when I questioned whether I would make it through. There were nights when I woke up in a panic, wondering how I missed the signs, how I let things get this far, how I was so blind. There were days when the shame of having been deceived for so long nearly swallowed me. There were moments when I felt such intense anger toward Robert, Jennifer, and Thomas that it scared me. But through it all, I kept moving forward, one step at a time, one day at a time. And now, on the other side of it all, I can honestly say I'm grateful for the journey. Not because it was easy or because I wished that pain on anyone, but because it made me the stronger, wiser, more authentic person I am today. I wouldn't trade the woman I've become, even if it meant avoiding all that pain. Because that woman who stood frozen in the dining room doorway, humiliated and ridiculed, wasn't really me. She was a diminished version of me that had been molded and diminished by years of manipulation. The woman I am now, who rises every morning knowing her worth, who sets firm boundaries, who loves fully but not naively, who uses her voice to help others, that is who I truly am. If you made it to the end of my story, thank you so much for listening. I know it was long, I know it had difficult and painful moments, but I hope it also offered hope and inspiration. I hope it showed you that no matter how dark your situation seems, no matter how completely you feel like you've lost yourself, there's always a way back. There's always the possibility of starting over. There's always hope for better days. If my story resonated with you in any way, if you identified with parts of my experience, or if you simply want to be part of a community where real stories are shared and real people support each other, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel. Leave a like if this story touched your heart in any way, and please share your own reflections or experiences in the comments. We are not alone in our struggles, and the more we share our stories, the more we break the silence that allows abuse to remain hidden. Every comment, every story shared, creates a network of support and understanding that can make all the difference to someone feeling isolated and lost. In the comments, I'd love to hear what impacted you most about this story. Was it the moment of revelation when Margaret appeared? Was it discovering the full extent of Robert's betrayal? Was it the journey of healing and rebuilding? Or was it something completely different that resonated with your own experience? Your perspectives and reflections not only help me better understand what's important to you, but also help others who read the comments realize they're not alone in their feelings and experiences. And if you know someone who's going through something similar, someone who's constantly criticized in their relationship, someone who's isolated from friends and family, someone who's losing access to their finances, someone who's starting to doubt their own sanity because they're constantly being invalidated, please share this story with them. Sometimes, Hearing someone else's experience is exactly what we need to recognize patterns in our own lives and find the courage to act. I want to emphasize again that if you are in a situation where you feel your safety is at risk, where there are threats or violence, please seek professional help immediately. There are hotlines available 24/7, with trained professionals who can help you create a safe exit plan. There are shelters that can provide temporary protection. There are domestic violence attorneys who can help with protective orders and other legal remedies. You don't have to face this alone, and asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength and wisdom. I also want to speak directly to those who may recognize traits of Robert, Jennifer, or Thomas in themselves. If you're reading this story and recognize that you use similar tactics of control, manipulation, or emotional abuse in your relationships, know that change is possible, but only if you genuinely take responsibility for your actions and commit to the difficult work of personal transformation. Seek therapy specializing in abusive behavior. Be honest with yourself about the harm you've caused. Understand that apologies without real behavioral changes are empty and cause more harm. And recognize that the people you've hurt are under no obligation to forgive you or stay in a relationship with you, even if you genuinely change. For professionals who may be watching, whether doctors, nurses, therapists, lawyers, social workers, or counselors, I encourage you to be alert for signs of emotional and financial abuse in your clients or patients. These types of abuse are often harder to identify than physical abuse because they don't leave visible marks, but they can be just as devastating. Ask gentle but direct questions. Create safe spaces where people can open up about what's really going on in their lives. Believe someone when they tell you about manipulation and control, even if they appear functional and successful on the outside. I was a competent nurse who seemingly had her life together but was being destroyed at home. The outer facade rarely tells the full story. Something I learned through this experience, and which I often share in my talks, is the difference between healthy boundaries and abusive control. Healthy boundaries are about controlling your own behavior and establishing what is acceptable for you personally. For example, I might say, I won't tolerate being yelled at, so if you start yelling at me, I'll leave the room until we can have a respectful conversation. That's a healthy boundary. Abusive control is about trying to control another person's behavior, thoughts, feelings, or relationships. For example, you can't talk to your friends without my permission, or you need to give me access to all your accounts and passwords, or you're exaggerating your feelings and being dramatic. These are control tactics disguised as concern or care. Another important concept is emotional responsibility. In healthy relationships, each person is responsible for their own feelings and reactions. You can express how something affected you, but you don't blame the other person for making you feel a certain way or demand that they change to manage their emotions. In abusive relationships, there's often a dynamic where one person is constantly blamed for the other's feelings. Look how angry you made me, that's your fault. If you hadn't done that, I wouldn't have reacted that way. This shifting of responsibility is a huge red flag. It's also important to understand that emotional abuse often follows a cycle. There's the tension phase, where small incidents build up and you feel like you're walking on eggshells trying not to provoke an explosion. There's the incident phase, where the abusive behavior actually occurs, whether through verbal outbursts, public humiliation, silent punishment, or other tactics. There's the reconciliation phase, where the abuser may apologize, promise to change, be exceptionally loving or attentive, making you believe things will get better. And there's the calm phase, where everything seems relatively normal and you start to think that perhaps you overreacted or that things really have improved. But then the cycle begins again, often intensifying over time. Recognizing this cycle helped me understand why it was so difficult to leave Robert, even when part of me knew something was deeply wrong. There were good times, calm periods where he was the charming man I fell in love with, and those moments gave me hope that maybe things could go back to the way they were in the beginning. But the reality is that those early moments were probably also part of the pattern, a phase of idealization designed to trap me emotionally before the real behavior began to emerge. Abusers are often charismatic and charming at first, which makes the transition to controlling and degrading behavior even more confusing and disorienting. One of the questions I get asked most often is how I didn't see the signs sooner, how I, an educated professional woman, could have been deceived for so long? And my answer is always that effective manipulation is gradual and subtle. No one wakes up one day and decides to accept being treated terribly. It's a slow process of normalization, where every small boundary violation is followed by excuses or justifications, where you constantly doubt your perceptions because you're repeatedly told you're misinterpreting things, where you become progressively isolated from external support systems that could offer objective perspective. Additionally, there were cultural and social factors at play. I was raised to believe that marriage was sacred, that you work through problems no matter what, that strong, dedicated women made sacrifices for their families. There was also the shame associated with divorce, the fear of social judgment, the worry about the financial impact and how it would affect my children. All of these factors worked together to keep me in an untenable situation long past the point at which I should have left. And I know I'm not alone. Many women stay in unhealthy relationships for complex reasons that go far beyond simply choosing to stay. So when someone tells you about being in an abusive relationship, please don't ask why they don't just leave. Ask them what they need to be safe. Offer practical support, not judgment. Understand that leaving can be the most dangerous time, that there are real financial and logistical considerations, that there may be children involved, that the abuser may have created circumstances that make leaving extremely complicated. Believe them when they describe what's happening, even if the abuser seems perfectly pleasant to the outside world. And continue to be a resource for support even if they're not ready to leave immediately, or if they leave and return multiple times, which is common. Returning to my own story, one of the most surprising aspects of the healing process was rediscovering who I was outside of being Robert's wife. For so many years, my identity had been intertwined with that role, and suddenly I had to discover Sarah as a separate individual. It was both terrifying and liberating. I started doing small things that Robert always criticized or discouraged. I returned to painting, a hobby I loved before we got married but had abandoned because Robert thought it was a waste of time. I began taking long walks alone in nature, something that had always brought me peace but that Robert said was dangerous and unnecessary. I reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with because Robert always found reasons why we couldn't attend social gatherings. Each of these small acts of self-healing felt monumentally significant. I was literally rebuilding my life, choice by choice, action by action. And what I discovered was that I truly liked the person I was becoming. I was stronger than I thought, more capable than I'd been allowed to believe, more interesting and complete than I'd ever given myself credit for. I didn't need Robert to validate or complete me. I was already complete, I'd just been taught to believe I wasn't. Margaret's role in my healing cannot be understated. She not only saved me from financial and emotional destruction through her timely intervention, but remained a constant presence of wisdom, support, and unconditional love. She understood my pain in a way few others could because she had lived her own version of family betrayal. But rather than letting it make her bitter or closed off, she used her experience to become more compassionate, more determined to help others, more committed to justice and truth. She modeled how to transform trauma into purpose, how to keep your heart open even after being deeply hurt, how to forgive not for the benefit of those who hurt you but for your own liberation. Margaret also taught me the kind of love I deserved. She showed me through her own actions how I should be treated, with constant respect, with genuine consideration of my feelings and opinions, with celebration of my accomplishments, with support during my struggles. When I began dating Michael, it was Margaret who helped me recognize that he was a good man, that his actions were consistent with his words, that he treated me as an equal and valued partner. And when I had moments of doubt or fear that I was repeating old patterns, it was Margaret who gently helped me see the differences, trust the work I had done in therapy, and believe that I deserved and could have a healthy relationship. Today, Michael and I have been together for 4 years, married for 2, and our relationship remains radically different from my first marriage in every way imaginable. We disagree sometimes, like any couple, but our disagreements are worked through respectful conversations, not through yelling, humiliation, or silent punishment. We make important decisions together, genuinely considering each other's perspectives and needs. We maintain our individuality and our own interests while also sharing common activities and goals. There is complete financial transparency and joint decision-making about money. There is mutual support for personal and professional growth. There is laughter, lots of laughter, something that was almost completely absent in recent years with Robert. And perhaps most importantly, there's safety. Safety to be authentically who I am without fear of criticism or rejection. Safety to express my feelings without being invalidated or accused of drama. Safety to maintain relationships with friends and family without jealousy or attempts at isolation. Safety to make mistakes without fear of disproportionate punishment. Safety to be vulnerable knowing that this vulnerability will be honored, not exploited. This sense of fundamental security in a relationship is something I never had with Robert, and now that I know what it feels like, I'll never settle for less. My children also found their way through this experience, though their journeys were different from mine. Madison eventually fully reconciled with what happened and developed a strong relationship with me again. She is now engaged to a wonderful man who treats her with respect and partnership, and she often tells me that my story helped her recognize a healthy relationship when she found it. She is finishing her master's degree in social work and wants to work with families in crisis, directly inspired by our experience. Tyler completed his undergraduate degree in psychology and is now pursuing his doctorate, focusing on family dynamics and intergenerational trauma. They both developed limited relationships with Robert, visiting occasionally but maintaining firm boundaries about what they discuss and how much involvement they allow. As for Robert, Jennifer, and Thomas, their post-prison stories have been varied. Thomas passed away 2 years after his trial from health complications, and while part of me felt sad for any loss of life, I recognized that he lived a long life where he consistently made choices to harm others for personal gain and faced just consequences for those choices. Jennifer continues to serve her sentence and, reportedly, has yet to fully accept responsibility for her actions. Robert, for his part, truly appears to be doing genuine work on personal change. He has completed multiple prison programs, works as a mentor to other prisoners, and maintains occasional correspondence with Tyler, where he demonstrates real insight into his past behaviors and a commitment to being different in the future. I don't know what the future holds for Robert after his eventual release. It's not my concern or responsibility. I wish him peace and genuine growth, but only from afar. My life has moved forward in ways that never would have been possible had I still been trapped in that toxic marriage. And while I would never wish the trauma I experienced on anyone, I recognize that he was the necessary catalyst for changes I probably never would have made by choice had circumstances not forced me to. There is power in surviving. There is strength in rebuilding. There is beauty in becoming who you truly are after years of being molded into something you weren't. And there is profound purpose in using your story, however painful, to help others navigate their own struggles. Every time I speak about my experience, every time a woman reaches out saying my story helped her recognize her own situation, every time I hear about someone who took action to protect themselves after hearing my story, I am reminded that my suffering created something meaningful and lasting. If there's one central message I want you to take away from this story, it's this: you have more strength within you than you ever imagined. You deserve to be treated with respect, dignity, and genuine love. You don't have to accept crumbs of affection or remain in situations that are destroying your soul. And no matter how lost you feel right now, no matter how completely your life seems to have fallen apart, there's always the possibility of rebuilding, of starting over, of being reborn into something more authentic and beautiful than you can currently imagine. Your story isn't over. This difficult chapter may just be the prologue to the most incredible story of transformation and empowerment. But you need to survive first. You need to seek help. You need to believe you deserve better. And you need to take one step at a time toward the life you want and deserve. It won't be easy. There will be days when you want to give up. There will be moments of doubt and fear. But on the other side of all this hard work is a version of you that is stronger, wiser, and freer than you are now. And that version is worth every difficult step of the journey. Thank you for listening to my story until the end. Thank you for allowing me to share not only the traumatic moments, but also the healing journey and the beautiful life I've built on the other side. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories of survival, transformation, and empowerment. Leave a like if this story touched you in any way. And please share your own reflections, experiences, or words of encouragement for others who may be struggling in the comments. Remember, you are not alone. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And you absolutely deserve a life of peace, love, and authenticity. Never doubt this, even when voices around you try to convince you otherwise. The truth about your worth lies within you, not in the opinions or treatment of people who choose to diminish you. Hold this truth close to your heart and let it guide you toward the freedom that awaits you. Until the next story, take care, be kind to yourself, and know that better days are coming. You are stronger than you know.